things, and of course Jesus being the Messiah, we look at what the Messiah came to do, and one of those things was to build a community. Now we've talked a little bit about the kingdom, but we also need to understand that the church obviously is, our representation of the kingdom today, but it's more than just being a part, one of God's people. God has always dealt with people as individuals, but he's also largely dealt with people inside of a community. Not as much so during the days of the patriarchs, whether that be men like Job and Abraham and others. They were family units, so you could say that there was a community there, but especially when you think of Israel just looking out for yourself. And we understand that same thing today with the church and with Christianity. We have a responsibility to, as Paul puts it, work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. It's still very individual as far as my relationship with God is my relationship with God. But no individual stands alone. God has created a community for us to be a part of within the church. And so we cannot divorce the two. We cannot divorce the idea of being a follower of Christ and being a part of Christ's community. Remember that promise that he gave when Peter and the apostles made their confession. He said, I will build my church, not I will save individuals only. He set out to build a community. And we also see this within the Old Testament. We also see this within prophecy. For example, let's turn over to the book of Micah. Micah chapter 5. And if somebody could read Micah chapter 5, verses 2 through 4, please.
From you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. And he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth.
Thank you. Okay, so we see here, of course, this is a messianic prophecy, as we understand it. It's talking about Bethlehem being the birthplace of this ruler, this one, this anointed one. And even there, I mentioned that Bethlehem is a very small town, and even too small to be considered among the clans, meaning it's so small that people don't even know it's there. And when we think about a place like Bethlehem, it might be remembered as the city of David, but it's certainly known as the city of Jesus, right? And if it were not the birthplace of Christ, it would otherwise have been a tiny town and a tiny nation in a relatively, obscure part of the world, right? And essentially that's what even Micah here, as he's writing, he's saying that that's what Bethlehem was even in those days. But it's not going to be that. He's going to come, this ruler, and of course, even here, as we've mentioned before, God is kind of hinting at things, that this ruler was not going to just be another king like David. It wasn't going to just be another regular person, right? Because his going forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Well, that's certainly not David, right? That's certainly not a human king. But the real key to this is verse 4, that he will rise and shepherd his flock. And this phrasing of shepherding, of course, ties back to the Davidic line, but also it's used in general of God caring for his people in both the Old and the New Testaments. But, again, what good is a shepherd without sheep? Yeah, I mean, how many of us that have no sheep in at our homes, are looking to hire a full-time shepherd? Right? So, again, if we're going to have this shepherd, if we're going to have this leader, well, he's not got to have people to lead. He's got to have a flock. And it's always mentioned kind of in that. And so the idea that we need to understand about this is, especially today in our society, it's very popular to kind of have a very individualistic idea. Like I said, we do have to have our own relationship with God. Nobody can save me. I have to have that relationship. But there are a lot of people who want to push aside any form of, for example, organization, or want to push aside the idea of needing to be a part of a congregation, needing to be a part of a church. And this can take a couple of different forms. One are those that, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, right? As though you can really divorce the two, because again, as we're going to see, the Spirit is a gift to the church. It's not a gift necessarily given solely to individuals. And whether we're talking about especially the miraculous gifts, were always intended to be of benefit to the community, not benefit to the individual, right? If I have the gift of healing and I don't go help anyone, what good is the gift, right? If I have the gift of prophecy but I never tell anyone, what's the point of the gift, right? And we'll talk about those more here in just a few moments. But so we have both this promise in this one verse of both the restoration of David's lineage, which of course is important, but also the idea that this leader is going to come forth and lead a flock. But we also see that even in the passage that we looked at from Isaiah chapter 2 last week, that God intended for there to be other nations besides Judah. We could look, for example, in Ezekiel. There is Ezekiel receives a vision of the two sticks bound together, and those two sticks representing Judah and Joseph, meaning that God was going to reunite Israel into a single nation. But then we also have additionally, for example, like in Zephaniah, references to all coast, islands, and nations coming and bowing down before God. In Isaiah 2, we talked about all the nations coming to the mountain of the Lord to learn of Him and be taught of Him. And so there's always going to be this group that is supposed to make up this covenant, that is supposed to make up this community. And it's not going to be without problems, especially when we consider what some of these prophecies say, because the majority of the Levitical law was to make Israel separate from the nations. And yet, again, God is promising that other nations are going to come and they're going to be welcomed by God. And so this is where if we're not careful, we can lead into what was a major first century problem, and that was what we often refer to as the Judaizers, who assumed that what God meant was you have to become Jewish, or you have to go through the law to then get to Christ. But as we kind of work through these things, we'll see that was not the case, but rather as these other nations come to God, as these other nations go to, as Isaiah said, the mountain of the Lord to learn of him, it's not so that they can become Jewish, but so that they can just come to God. But again, that creates its problems, right? If you look at our New Testament, you've got a large part of Romans, basically the entirety of the book of Galatians, and numerous other passages in our New Testament are devoted to the relationship between the Jewish Christian and the Gentile Christian. And so it's not obviously going to be without, I guess, issue. But again, since it's God doing the gathering, he's provided ways for us to have this united community. And that brings us to kind of our second. I said the first would be those that want to somehow divorce religion and spirituality. Then there are those who understand maybe that they have to be a part of the church, but believe that they can maybe just be a part of the church, what we might call the church universal. And these are people, and I have no problem with visiting, and I think visiting amongst congregations is something that we really need to encourage more. But we've probably all known or met those people who just kind of seem to always be visiting. Right? That seem to just always bounce around from congregation to congregation and never really... And there's nothing in the New Testament about any sort of formal placing of membership or anything, and I don't honestly think that that's incredibly necessary. But what I do think is that we're supposed to build up the church, and we're supposed to be a part of building something, and we can't do that if we're in a different place every week. And so again, there's nothing wrong with visiting, and there's nothing wrong with those types of things, but again, if we're going to be a part of a community, we have to actually be a part of that community, and we have to contribute to that community. And we'll kind of work on these ideas as we go through this, but I'm just trying to get some of these things kind of out before us. So let's look at some passages in the New Testament that do address this. For example, Ephesians chapter 2. And if somebody could read Ephesians 2, verses 11 through 17, please.
Therefore, remember that formerly you were all, you who are Gentiles by birth, called uncircumcised, by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separated from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you once were far away and have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near.
Thank you. All right. And there at the end there, verse 17 is a quotation from Isaiah, again, speaking of these things, of this promise that God is going to bring in more people than just Israel. But here, as Paul is writing to the Ephesian brethren, he's addressing this Jewish-Gentile divide, And here is largely a reminder to the Gentiles that, well, if the law was still in effect, they would be excluded, right? At the same time, because every coin has two sides, so to speak, it's also a reminder to the Jewish Christians that the law is no longer in effect, right? Because again, Paul's statement about they were formerly without hope, without God, excluded, but now they are included. They now have that hope. They now have all of these things. And so, in Romans chapter 11, Paul utilizes the image of an olive tree, and he talks about the grafting in, about how some of those natural branches were cut off, talking about the Jewish people who disbelieved, and that the Gentiles were then grafted in from wild olive branches, right? Kind of the same thing. In both passages, he's using the idea that, yes, Judaism formed this core. As, again, Jesus preached to the Gentiles, the early church was made up, I don't believe exclusively, but nearly exclusively of Jewish people, and then began to expand out. And we even see this in the book of Acts, right? In Acts chapters 10 and 11, when Peter goes to Cornelius' household, and then in chapter 11 has to explain to the church in Jerusalem why he went to a Roman's house. Because they were still stuck on this. God is restoring Israel. God is restoring us. He's restoring the covenants. And that was, the attempt at least was made to be clear that that's not what was going on. And yet, it continues, because it's then in Acts chapter 15 when faced with these Judaizing Christians, or the Judaizing teachers who claim to have been sent by Peter and others in Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas have to go to Jerusalem and confront the church there about these teachings. And again, this is all part of this bringing together, and still the old law also offers support to the church, as Paul says in Romans chapter 15, that all those things that were written before times were written for our understanding and our learning. It does show us God, and it does show us what he likes, what he dislikes, even though his methodologies of dealing with people, the methodologies of salvation and forgiveness and all of those things have changed. It's still there. It still demonstrates how gracious, how merciful God is, but then also it also shows us what happens when his grace and patience runs out. Right? Okay, so there was always the intention of creating this flock, the church, and that's also important because, as I've stated before, there are people out there that believe that the church was a plan B, so to speak. Again, this is born from what we often refer to as millennialism. More often than not, we hear the term premillennialism, but it's actually a part of all millennialism. It's just premillennialism is the flavor of our current era. But there's also post-millennialism and so on and so forth. And what that generally refers to is it's a misunderstanding and misapplication of the passage in the book of Revelation where it speaks of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. They again are trying to interpret that as literal because there is this obsession with the Messiah having to establish a physical kingdom, having to establish, and essentially what their belief is that Jesus is going to come back and establish that kingdom because he failed the first time. And so he instituted the church as the bridge from Judaism to this, or from Israel to this other kingdom that he's going to establish, which is in in their minds, still going to be kind of Israel. And again, there's different takes and flavors and things, but we need to understand that the community of God was always the intention. And before Jesus even talked openly about his death, burial, and resurrection, he spoke of building his church. And so it wasn't something that halfway through Jesus' earthly ministry, spending 30 plus years amongst the people, he suddenly goes, oh, this isn't going to work. And pulls the escape chute, But again, most people, when they buy in to these types of teachings and things, they don't really think about what it really means. And so one of the things that we need to do is help them to see what that really means. And if Jesus can fail at unifying the people, then how do we know for sure that he succeeded in forgiving our sins? How can we be confident that he's going to come back and that there's going to be a resurrection? He failed once by their reasoning. And again, sometimes the best thing that we can do for people is to show them the broken reasonings that they're operating in. And so, again, God always intended for the church to be there. Now, that being said, the world was not necessarily ready to jump directly from Judaism to the church. And God also foretold that. Anybody know what the very last prophecy of the Old Testament is? Well, it's open book, so let's go ahead and go to Malachi.
I think you know that comment. Coming of Elijah?
The coming of Elijah. Yep, that's it.
Gold star for go!
Yes, the very last prophecy, the very last, the final two verses of Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6. I'm going to send Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, and he will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse. He's talking about John and John's work in preparing the way for the Messiah. And so Israel needed John to help prepare for Jesus, who then helped prepare them for the church. Because it was going to be very different. And to some extent, there's also the hint here that part of what was going to need to happen was a restoration of the heart. As I've mentioned before, after the Babylonian captivity, Israel did not really struggle with idolatry the way that she once did, but it still struggled very much with their hearts. And we can see this to some extent in some of Jesus' interactions, for example, with the Pharisees and other leaders of the day, that they had become extremely regimented, they'd become extremely binding, especially in a physical sense in regards to certain things. Right, I mean, even him accusing them of not washing their hands. For example, when Jesus and his disciples are walking through the field and they take the grain and rub it in their hands and eat it, and they say, well, you didn't wash your hands. Hand washing isn't mentioned anywhere in the law. It's a rabbinical teaching. And it wasn't hand washing like what we think of hand washing when we're thinking about disease. It was a ritualistic washing away of any contact with the Gentile world before you ate. They didn't have the idea. Germs weren't actually even like realistically known about until like the 1800s, and it almost took to the 1900s before people went, "Oh, I guess those things are bad for us." I'm not even joking. So lost my train of thought there.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Going back to the Matthew 16,
Mm-hmm.
On this rock I will build my church.
Mhm.
That Greek word is ecclesia.
Mhm.
And did they understand what that meant?
They-
That is a group, it's a gathering group?
That's what the word means, is a group gathered for a purpose. And so even though they didn't necessarily have the idea of church as we think of church, they knew that the Greek word ecclesia, or if Jesus was speaking in Aramaic, the Aramaic equivalent, they knew that he was saying, I'm going to build my group of people. Again, the idea of the church as we think of it today is very different from what the first century experienced. Because for a number of different reasons, not the least of which is that if a religious group was not recognized by the state, it didn't exist as far as they were concerned, and could not exist. So it wasn't until really the second century that you even had something like church buildings even come into play, because a non-entity cannot own something. But even then, it took really until the third, fourth centuries before even the idea of anything like what we would consider a church building today even became popular. Otherwise, it was just meeting places, and again, it was about the people coming together wherever, and especially during the times of great persecution, the church often met in various places because meeting in the same place makes you an easy target. And so, again, we have to be careful that we don't look at things through our 21st century eyes and our 21st century traditions and our 21st century American traditions especially. And remember that, again, the term ecclesia just means the called out, and in fact in the book of Acts it's even made in reference to the city council. But again, the city council, ecclesia, is still a very specific group of people coming together for a specific purpose. And so even if they didn't have the understanding of church as we know it, they understood what Jesus was meaning when he said, I'm going to build my people.
Bill had a further comment.
Yeah, he says Malachi said Elijah, not John. And yes, that's a reference that, again, the people weren't sure if God meant he was going to send Elijah back in some resurrected form, but it was the idea of the spirit of Elijah that he's going to send back a voice crying in the wilderness, so to speak. As John very much embodied the spirit of Elijah, a man that was a powerful prophet, but also kind of operated, well, he was kind of a wandering prophet, even as John was. So a lot of different parallels there, but Jesus speaks of John being that spirit of Elijah, and John himself makes that connection as well for us in the gospel accounts. So again, it was the idea of who Elijah represented. Okay, so of course there has to be this kind of transition period, and if we assume that, say, Jesus began his ministry almost right after the socially accepted time of his being considered a rabbi, which at the time was about 30 years old, and he lived on the earth for about 3.5 years. That's not a lot of time. 3.5, 4 years, maybe 5 if we stretch out the time between when John started his ministry and Jesus started his ministry. But I don't know that that's there, honestly. That's not a lot of prep time, right? But it's also during this time that God was laying the foundations that were necessary, and there were four foundational things, four things that had to happen before the church could become a reality. The first of which was the crucifixion. That is in itself, again, when we look at Matthew 16 or the other accounts of that same incident, almost immediately after that confession that he is the Christ, Jesus then tells them he must suffer and die. And he then continues to expound upon it, talking about that he's going to be delivered over to the hands of the Romans and so on and so forth. But another aspect of this was the idea of the cornerstone, or the stone of testimony, or what would also become the stumbling block for some. Right? So let's go to the book of Romans, chapter 9. So Romans chapter 9, Paul is talking about the sadness of, and his personal sadness that so much of Israel rejected Jesus, and he's going to mention here in verses 32. Well, let's go ahead and just read verses 30 through 33 if somebody doesn't mind doing that for us.
What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, given righteousness of faith. And Israel pursuing the law of righteousness has not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Because they did not seek it by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone. And that's as far as you want me to
And verse 33, please.
As it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone and rock of offense, and whoever believes on him will not be put to shame.
Thank you. And so here Paul again, as he's talking about, and the book of Romans as a whole deals with the Jewish-Gentile divide a lot in a lot of different facets. But here, as he's talking about it, he's talking about the fact that so many in the Gentile world so readily accepted God by faith and therefore received the gifts of righteousness and things, and yet so many from Israel would be excluded. And he gets to the heart of the matter that, again, they were focused so much on physical, on works, that they were going to somehow do enough things according to the law that God would somehow owe them heaven, is essentially what it comes down to. But he points out that, again, here as he's quoting from Isaiah again, that there is going to be this stone of stumbling laid, this rock of offense, and that was Jesus. We can see elsewhere, Peter talks about the stone which the builders rejected becoming the chief cornerstone. Although some translators like to use the term capstone. Okay. Yes, a cornerstone is foundational, and a capstone is more like the centerpiece of an arch, but you can't remove either one and have the building be structural anymore. So whichever way, it doesn't really matter. I think cornerstone is more in line with most of the other verbiage in the New Testament, where it talks about Jesus being a foundation. For example, Paul also in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 talks about no one can lay any other foundation except for that which Jesus laid. And so I'm going to personally continue to use Cornerstone until somebody makes a really strong argument, but there are even English translations that use Capstone, so just so you know, it's out there. But again, this his death and his crucifixion had to happen because this stone of offense, right? Because cursed is he who hangs on a tree. That's again from the law, and there had to be this sacrifice. But also, we look to passages like Hebrews chapter 9. Let's go ahead and turn over there. So on one hand, we see that Jesus' death had to, in a way, kind of confront people on their maybe mistaken view of the Messiah, and that, again, they thought he was going to be a conquering king, and yet, what is he? He's a silent lamb being led to slaughter. But also, we see from the book of Hebrews that if somebody could read verses 16 and 17 of chapter 9, Hebrews 9, 16 and 17, please.
For this reason, he is a mediator of a new covenant, so that, since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called many receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must be of necessity be the death of one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never enforced while the one who made it lives. Therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people.
Thank you. So here, some translations say covenant, others say testament, but this is the word here is where we get our last will and testament. This is the idea. And so when he's talking about this, he's meaning, again, when does a will come into effect? When they die, right? When we look at, for example, the parable of the prodigal son, one of the most shocking things is the son coming to his father and demanding his inheritance before his father's death. That in itself was supposed to show us how kind of twisted the mind of this young man had become. That, well, this is mine, I want it now. That's not how that works. But as he's saying, a covenant or a testament is only valid at the death of the one who made it. And so Jesus had to die in order for his last will and testament, for his teachings as we see them in the New Testament, for his plan to meet its fruition. He had to die. More than that, we also see the mention of the blood, that the covenants are not inaugurated without blood. Again, there had to be the shedding of blood. And so this also, on a side note, helps us to understand that, yes, Jesus was an actual person. He was actually human. There was actual body. There was actual blood. He actually died. Okay? Matter of fact, I just had on my Instagram somebody talking about maybe Jesus just passed out. And that's why he was able to pop up. Here's the thing. If you lose so much blood that you pass out and they just lay you in a quiet place for 3 days, you don't magically get better. Okay? There's not a nurse, doctor, or anyone, who's ever, you can't just lose that much blood, go into shock, and then just get wrapped up in some linen and laid in a dank place and all of a sudden your body's like, oh, I'm fine now. Not how that works. But it's out there. There are people that believe this. And there are people that have been told that that's what they need to believe for various reasons, both religious and non-religious. But again, the covenant required his death. The covenant required the shedding of his blood, his sacrifice. And I would also look at, let's go over to John chapter 10. And if somebody could read verses 14 through 18, please.
I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I'm sorry, 14 to what?
Through 18, please.
I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father.
Thank you. So Jesus is also pointing out here that he needs to bring in other sheep, right, that are not part of this flock, going back to our previous thing. But more so, he's talking about the fact that he has to lay down his life. Not that it's being taken from him. Also an important point, Jesus at any time could have stopped the proceedings. He had that power. But he laid it down. He made the sacrifice for us so that he could save us. Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, Paul there talks in his talking with the Ephesian elders, he says that we've been purchased by his own blood, by Jesus' own blood, the price that was paid for us. And so, again, the crucifixion had to happen before the church could come into effect. I would even argue that, based on what Jesus says here in John 10, one of the ways he was going to seek those individuals that were outside of the sheepfold was by giving up his life, by demonstrating his love for people in general, for humanity, and so he sacrificed himself. Okay, we are out of time, so we will pick up, Lord willing, next week with the other three foundational things, or the other three things that had to happen before the church could really come into its own. So just try to remember, number one, the crucifixion. And we'll pick up there. So thank you very much. And for those that are watching online, especially on our YouTube channel, we are going to have a break in between our class time here and our worship so that we can kind of reset some things with the camera, and just be looking for that link again here in just a couple of minutes. So, all right. Thank you very much.